Donald Trump recently announced that the United States would unilaterally withdraw from the nuclear control treaty executed by Donald Reagan and Gorbachev in 1987, known as INF. In parallel, hard negotiations for North Korea disarmament continue, but those who demand disarment does not accept bribes, and they showed their absolute superiority in weapons. Who has asked disarmament to the United States or Israel? Will they be willing to do it if the world asked it? Or capitalism does not stand for that? What consequences could bring the last decisions regarding to the proliferation of weapons? The superpowers are increasing their military arsenals and are activating alarms. Is it possible to avoid weapons competition through agreements? And the contest is the appendix of the current geopolitical contest. This is our critical move today. In the midst of tensions with the neighbor Russia and the Scandinavian peninsula, on last Thursday, Norway is the scenario of military maneuvers of NATO. These operations are called Trident Juice and will extend until November 7, and they have deployed 10,000 vehicles, 250 planes, and 65 ships in 4 counties of North and South Norway, the Baltic Sea, North Atlantic, and airspaces of other northern countries. We describe this 55,000 soldiers with other countries of the North. Secretary Stoltenberg said from Brussels that it's not about re-editing the Cold War, but sending the message of a bloc that is ready to defend its allies in case of any threat, even if there is not a confrontation. We must have larger exercises and know how to defend all our allies against any threat. And this is what we're doing today with success. Now we'll go to Russian news agency Sputnik, where Russia expresses concern for these movements. We follow the route of NATO towards the active militarization of the northern continent, said Ministry of Defense Sergei Shoigu during a meeting with his Greek peer. Since 2016, NATO approved an unprecedented increase of its weapons under the excuse that Russia is seeking to destabilize Ukraine at the time. He mentioned that the U.S. decision of withdrawing from the treaty we mentioned before, INF, shall have serious consequences, mainly for Europe, because both Russia and the United States have mutually accused themselves in different occasions of developing systems that violate that treaty. In any case, the Russian response is very clear. This is a provocation in relation to military exercises performed at this time in Norway, and also it is this decision adopted by Trump of withdrawing from the INF is not convenient. Our recommendation is in Telesur, written by Alfredo Caliste, Lebanese author, professor of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM. If you wish peace, prepare for nuclear war. This is a Trump strategy versus Russia and China. That's the title of our article. Foreign Affairs magazine of influential Ministry of Foreign Affairs talked about the discussion about nuclear war of the United States against Russia and China. This magazine referred to an article of one of the main authors of the defense strategy from the Pentagon, where they are talking about the initiation of competition between the large powers. This is a strategy for the new reality of superpowers. Former Deputy Secretary prevents that any future confrontation with Russia and China could become nuclear when, during a stronger and uncertain struggle, each party could be tempted to take the nuclear weapon to confront the challenge and prove the other party's resolution, or just to continue fighting. It's a position that is contrary to former Reagan Secretary of State that said that it is not time to build large nuclear arsenals, but to eliminate this threat. The worst would be to think that Russia and China will remain with their arms crossed. From this recommendation, we will now link with Moscow, because we have told about Russia's response. Its authorities have declared that they are struggling to keep this treaty. The United States is threatening with leaving, and it's important to have international alliances, that Europe put more pressure, and the countries members of the European Union fight to revert Trump's decision. We connect with Hanselora from Moscow. Greetings to you and our viewers. Russia wants to keep the INF signed with the United States in 1987 that does not have expiration dates that and tells us that about the contents of the treaty. The U.S. President Trump has threatened to leave this treaty. In the case of Kremlin, in case of terminating this agreement, he should seek for an alternative that keeps the contents of that agreement. On November 11, there will be a meeting between Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin in France, and undoubtedly this will a key topic on defense. The United States, together with the member countries of NATO, are trying to fence the borders of Russia, especially upon the possibility of opening a military base in Poland and the increase of militia. On August 13, the United States launched a new strategy and talked about increasing military effectives near Belarus. NATO, from 25 October to November 7, are carrying out a huge military maneuver aimed to defense in case of Russian actions. The anti-Russian military actions are clear, with the participation of around 50,000 soldiers and 250 aircraft of those countries, a total of 31 countries and 65 warships. Russia continues urging for military collaboration and to keeping this treaty, to seek respect both in aim of preserving peace in the region. Thank you, Hansel. We need to ask ourselves the reactivation of the weapons career, if this is what we're seeing, is important or essential for reoxygenizing capitalism. Is the weapons career a part of all this competition? We leave these questions on the geopolitical board and make a pause. The arms race, continuity or re-addition is our hypothesis today in Critical Move. We will see what BBC talks. INF Nuclear Treaty, why Trump's decision of withdrawing the United States from the treaty that helped end the Cold War. This is one of the facts that allows us to understand this hypothesis. It is a historic agreement that was closed in Reykjavik after a complex process of negotiations. Geneva was signed by Reagan and Gorbachev in times of the perestroika. It was the first of its gender in reducing nuclear missiles instead of only setting a limit. It became effective on January 1st of 1988, and both actors had eliminated 1,600 missiles. When the verification of the treaty was signed, the most severe in history of nuclear control, was designed to eliminate all INF systems declared effective and to assure the non-possession and use of these missiles. This is the explanation of the State Department that was a milestone for European security because the United States and Soviet Union had its arsenal deployed. They're talking about the possibility of re-editing the Cold War. What was the arms race at the time? One of the historic background that allow us to understand what is happening now. Between 981 and 989, Ronald Reagan designed an aggressive foreign policy against the USSR and those that confronted U.S. exceptionalism in Latin America. That was the starting point of the arms race during the Cold War. On March 23, 1983, Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative to ensure Western technological superiority in eventual nuclear conflict with the USSR. The first step of the program was the deployment of Pershing II missiles in Germany that made Europe in a true battlefield in case of a confrontation against Warsaw Pact members. That program was a detonating point of the Soviet bloc. This could not continue the rhythm in the arms race. Reagan forced the USSR to sign nuclear disarmament agreements and to pull out of Afghanistan in 1988. The arms race was a competition between countries to develop unrivaled weapons and armies and needs support from large corporations. Its effects are real and symbolic. The strength is measured in conditionings, pressures, intimidations, and demonstration of superiority. It can't be developed without the presence of great corporations that provide food, clothing, communication system, missiles, satellites, and any device that depends on state or private financing. The arms race can be divided in first phases: First World War, Second World War, and the Cold War, and the current times characterized by multipolarity. Involved stakeholders like the arms industry attempts against humanity. What about the great industrial complex and the misuse of this type of innovation represent for the states? What is good for the United States is good for GM and vice versa. The phrase was said by Charles Whitson, who for decades was a weapons provider for the White House. All armed conflicts initiated by U.S. military conflicts are caused by economic reasons to control gas, oil, places, and influenced by the earnings of the huge weapons industries that obtain the benefits of war. Whoever responds to the interest of these transnationals in the United States will receive more financing in electoral campaigns and more possibilities of winning elections. Once in power, these politicians must respond to the favors. According to the Stockholm International Institute Since 2001, the weapons industries grew in 35%. In Africa, for example, military expense increased in 62% in the last 10 years. The companies that receive more benefits for weapons is first Lockheed Weapons, followed by BAE Systems, specialized in light ammunition. German EADs, Italian Finmeccanica, Boeing, and U.S. companies Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, and Raytheon. How does this influence the different wars in the Middle East and Africa? A report of the organization Conflict Armament Research reveals that after analyzing war waste, they saw that 30% of the weapons used by terrorists in Syria were manufactured in the United States. It is a time for deepening in this critical move. For this, we will make it with our guests of the day, David Gomez, Venezuelan writer established in Moscow, and Jorge Zubetaria, Argentinian journalist from Buenos Aires. Welcome and thank you for being here. The question for Jorge Luis: what consequences would the U.S. withdrawal from an INF agreement be? Europe would be the most damaged. Would China put pressure? What analysis do you make? Good morning to all. Firstly, this is nothing new. What the United States and its colonies of NATO are doing. The United States has a military expenditure of $623 billion, and the rest of NATO countries, 29, do not have much expense. Only 93 million dollars. So the United States is conducting this arms race, and in this case, the action against Russia. What is happening attacking Russia is nothing new. In 1918, a letter to the U.S. workers, Lenin said that U.S. multimillionaires are probably the richest of all, and that we're in safest geographic situation. We're talking about the First World War. They got richer than anyone, and even the richest met as the fruit of pillage hundreds of thousands of $billions, and each dollar is stained with mud of the secret agreements with the UK and its allies. It also talked about the role of England, as Lenin said, under Hippocratic participation, as well as France. That Russia was undergoing to support counter-revolutionary groups. What is happening now is nothing new. But what is new is that Russia is not the same as 1918. The Reverset Treaty, whereby Russia had to grant territory to Germany to reach peace separately, not to confront the rest of the imperial powers, remained in history, and at this time, capitalist imperialism, is in an organic crisis and pretends to continue keeping the world's hegemony by confronting Russia. And at this time, with the great mobilization of troops in Norway in a military exercise called Trident Juncture 18, where more than 50,000 soldiers, 250 aircraft, 100,000 vehicles, 20 individual ships, and one U.S. carrier participate, and they pretend to do what they did in the First World War. Russia learned a lot about all this, and not only the conflict with Russia, the conflict is with China. The United States want to have military relations with Taiwan, which disturbs China because Taiwan is part of China. And the United States with Trump is trying to confront several countries at the time, and in the case of our America, is trying to impose a fascist government as the one elected in Brazil and in Argentina. They will not be able to defeat Russia because Russia has large experience in confrontations with capitalistic coalitions, and I think all this will end in nothing because even if they have the INF Treaty, they will negotiate a new treaty because they cannot develop a nuclear war against the world. I would like to add David from Moscow. Jorge was saying that there are elements that are unprecedented, that are not new, and others that are. I want to ask you, David, did the last arms race end with the Berlin Wall fall, and or did that race didn't end and continued silently? Thank you very much for your invitation to my friends in Telesur. We must analyze the fact that we cannot study history in a fragmented way. It's a continuity. We see how the Cold War is simply a moment of a war that is general and that has become part of a scenario, war scenario where capitalistic countries are pressing to control the world. How shall we interpret this? The United States is trying to impose through military industry because in the political and commercial fields it is losing. We mustn't forget strange relations that are taking place at this time with China, and currently these relations have been increasingly controversial with Russia in spite of the speeches that are contradicting permanently. We've seen the first meeting between President Trump and President Putin will come ahead where unfortunately these relations are deteriorating. And even if speeches aim, for example, the NATO spokesman says they don't want to start a new arms race, we see how all scenarios and all actions point to another focus. We see how this year Russia performed military exercise, the largest in the Cold War, 300,000 soldiers, 80 ships, 36,000 war vehicles, and we see now how NATO in Norway puts in that scenario military exercise with 50,000 military, even including soldiers that are not part of NATO like Finland and Norway. All this deserves a deeper analysis, and we must include a much more complex war for political hegemony of the world. And this war, unfortunately, did not end in the agreement between Reagan and Gorbachev, but continues. The threat continues against humanity because the nuclear war is addressed only against one ideology, and we're talking about the danger against the entire humanity by powers that end by assuming a war position, but especially this arrogant position of the United States of keeping a bipolar vision of the world. against Russia. With this decision, I asked Jorge Luis, Donald Trump announced his wish to withdraw from the INF. Will this destroy the legal framework on which the global strategic stability system is based? I want to talk about declarations of Alexei Spukov. The United States does not want to limit the negotiation of these weapons systems, but wants to put mid-scope missiles in countries near Russian borders. You said it was not new. The United States has always provoked Russia. And I ask you again, is the United States seeking to destroy the legal system? Are political agreements enough? What the United States is trying to do is keep its hegemony within an organic crisis of capitalism in the world, essentially the United States. It has a billionaire external debt, many conflicts. Now with the conflict with China, probably China will launch U.S. treasury bonds and the dollar will fall. You know, the United States is almost in bankruptcy and is kept by the industrial military complex, but the United States prohibited a Chinese company from manufacturing some elements in the weapons industry and condemned that company not to participate in trade with the United States. So the United States is in a bottleneck, and I think it is leading an imperial capitalist system in its terminal phase that is in crisis. So on one hand, Trump, the president, must speak like this to try to calm down the hawks he has inside the United States, that since they never undergo a war, they don't think of this. But on the other hand, he must think of reality. Today, the United States is not confronting a Russia in 1918 or China in 1949. Russia, China, Iran are now developed, have also developed their military systems, and from the economic financial point of view, are destroying the United States in their own territory. For this reason, while now they want to annul the treaty that Reagan executed, if he still has some brain, he will know that nuclear war ends the lives of everyone. It is now making missile exercises in Norway, because these exercises are a provocation. They will culminate on November 7th, that is the anniversary of the Russian Revolution. So nobody in the world can accept U.S. unilateralism and pretended hegemony. So they're going to have to think it twice before launching a nuclear war. If they install mid-scope rockets in countries nearby Russia would probably keep nuclear missiles in countries near the United States. Sputnik talks about a Russian analyst is talking about installing missiles in Cuba. I don't think Cuba would want this, but the United States is leading to this type of confrontation that would probably end sooner, because this country cannot tell us what we do. Now I ask David, the relation between purchasers and suppliers. The thing is that the world is being disputed between Russia, China, and the United States. The world fears a strategic alliance between Russia and China. that would put the United States against the wall, not only in the military field, but also the commercial field. Now, how can the U.S. pretend to fall out of this crisis and the political field by developing a war, or at least an attempted war that seeks to develop the U.S. military industry? We have seen this in the different facets of history throughout the 20th century. And we noticed how North America uses its industrial apparatus to oxygenize it economically. It is not strange that Donald Trump assume a strong position, understanding that his candidacy as a politician is financed by this industry that supplies the largest amount of money inside the United States. We must also include in this analysis the role of social movements, parties, and other countries of the world. The world must express itself against an attempted war that brings only negative consequences for the peace policy and understanding between the different nations. It started a process where social movements and political parties of the world and peace movements of the world present strong positions against the power with consistent policy in favor of humanity. For example, in Moscow, ECLAC, Russia Forum is being held to find constructive solutions for the world. So it's important for us not only to make the analysis around the war, but how we combat the war. Governments and social movements must take part of the situation as essential stakeholders. So the U.S. military industry is not stronger than humanity's will. Javier Rodriguez from Moscow and from Buenos Aires, Argentina, thank you very much for being with us, and tell us your considerations on critical move. Both political analysts. We will make a pause now and continue analyzing the risks of the proliferation of weapons. Strategic moves. Let's review the latest news between the United States, China, France, and Russia to what they call a reactivation of the arms race. The United States announced its unilateral leaving of the INF, signed in 1987, and increased tension with Russia. The Nuclear Force Treaty was signed at its time by Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. John Bolton, in charge of U.S. security, met with the Minister of Foreign Affairs. After the meeting, the White House official did not say anything about a possible leaving this agreement. U.S. position was criticized by the main world leaders. Emmanuel Macron said it was the U.S. decision was foolish. Chinese president said Trump should think 2 times. Germany said that the treaty was one of the main pillars on which all architecture of European security Treaty was based. Russian President Putin said that if the United States fails to comply with the INF, Russia would have to respond. It's a spiral that could reactivate the arms race and put in risk the survival of the planet. Trump's decision is consistent with the possible entrance of NATO to both Georgia and Ukraine, where Russia has strategic interests. Tension increased, and therefore Russia increased its defense plan. It's a security perimeter in Venezuela, in East Russia, Georgia. They said it was a serious economic and military problem. In this way, the United States has reopened the possibility of a new arms race. In February this year, the United States declared it added 2 atomic bombs to its arsenal.
Sumamos a Felix Roque.
We will add Felix Roque,
of
the Bolivarian University of Venezuela, who has a radio program, Anti-Imperialist Radio. Lovely to have you here. I would like to ask you about the military exercises that NATO is carrying out in Norway. Is it, as the UN General Secretary saying it's not a confrontation, but just send a message of a joint message? I think it's important. Defender what? We must remember Che Guevara with a phrase he said in Montevideo. Imperialism, we shouldn't believe him. I listened to NATO's Secretary General, and when he said that we shouldn't fear Russia's monitoring, I hope that exercises do not bother. It calls my attention that for the NATO performed such magnitude exercise in the Norway Sea with the participation of non-NATO members. This means undoubtedly that it's a concealed aggression against Russia, that is a country that has a demonstrated military power, but at the same time it is the continuity of an arms race that was never suspended and remained silent since the meetings between Reagan and Gorbachev after USSR's fall. The United States has lost hegemony in many places of the world. We know that in Syria they lost, even if they ended with the Libyan government and Iraq government. The great threat of Iran has impeded him to. They have pretended to fence them with the commercial sanctions. We must also consider the great commercial alliance between Russia and China, the second economic power of the world today, which is a great concern for the United States. We must also say that after all this are the true war makers, the financial military complex of the United States that put the weapons in while the people are put for the rest of the world. We must remember how many people died in the first war, the second war, 40, 50 million death toll. And as the Pope Francis says, it's a war that is taking place with different methods, with invasions, governments, oil. So that race is not an appendix, but a part of the current geopolitical moves. Yes, of course, and it seems that the United States and the Pentagon is trying to revive a unipolar world that is senseless. Huge geopolitical powers have appeared. India is one, China is a huge one, and of course Russia. a country that is very highly developed. Of course, the United States continue to be a very strong military power. They are devoting more than $6 billion per year to produce all kinds of weapons. This budget would be used to solve world hunger and solve so many problems.
Por ejemplo, el de no proliferación de armas no han servido de nada.
So the proliferation agreements have been useless. Countries that make no sense of these agreements. Well, Trump just kicked the INF. He announced his withdrawal from this treaty. And this is something very serious because it's a threat, as French President said. And the United States have these and other behaviors. Remember that they left the Kyoto Treaty for the planet's environmental protection, and they are taking the same kind of measures in other fields. And we must understand that Trump administration is pretending to revive positions of the hawks that we saw in times of Bush and September 11, where they took measures that led to very difficult situations in Europe and good part of Asia. Of course, we must consider what is happening in our region. What a role has the Latin American continent here? Just a couple of days before ultra-rightist government won in Brazil. And one of his first declarations is the liberalization of weapons in Brazil. He announced that he will not propitiate a military intervention against Venezuela, but he will be part of an aid commission. We know what aid means. Brazil has a huge border with us to the south, and they want to take more than 5,000 soldiers to the Venezuelan border. This is something very dangerous for our country that has been militarily fenced and is growing every day. Therefore, this continent must play an important role. We hope that the arrival of Andrés Manuel López Obrador in Mexico on December 1st somehow means a point of reflection in relation to the geopolitical interfering policies of the United States against our peoples. We must understand that world peace is based on non-intervention to internal matters of countries. This is the main threat to the globe. Yes, until now it has no limits. And we must also understand this will take place in midterm elections in November, where Trump runs the risk of losing the Senate that he controls today. If that happens, Democrats will control both chambers, which will not be positive for Donald Trump. I understand that this war stream of Mr. Trump and his NATO allies seeks to send a message, even to Russia, because of the attitude he has assumed in political, military, strategic issues of the world. So today's capacities not only belong to the United States, but other stakeholders who have had progress and strategic progress in that field. Yes, the other powers are not the same as in 1914 or 1940. Yesterday, a student told me the Cold War is getting hot. And I told him I would take his phrase because it is so. Today, the plurality of factors in the plan has told us that there are very different objective conditions to what happened. And that therefore a war of this kind must consider the emerging forces of these times, and that imperialism that has been defeated in many areas, that has even had to abandon important positions it had in Asia, must understand that its plans of interventions and command are not the same as the Second World War. What role do the industrial weapons complexes play? All these corporations, Lockheed and European, German companies that produce sophisticated weapons in the planet, that get richer with this. They produce capital for this. And Trump administration, a capitalistic administration, of course, sees a business in war. It has always been a business for the empire. Another thing, there is no war for humanity, for salvation. It's not a war like our liberators did when they left here to liberate the people from the Spanish. These are wars to impose governments and also to control and to take advantage of huge natural wealth in the countries. Libya was intervened, divided in 4 parts, and it has been geographically, but now destroyed, but is producing more than 4 million barrels of crude a day. So that war was to take over that crude. So the need of containing the arms weapon is as effective now as today. And this is, Venezuela represents the most important crude reserves on the planet besides others, of course. Its close relation with the U.S. Is also an element that must be understood. It must assume actions in all areas because it's a policy of alliance, and we need to preserve the sovereignty of our country and keep our own and legitimate government in view of these economic pretensions. Yesterday we were analyzing public international law, the famous DIP, and we were reminding the Westphalia treaties in 1648, the 100-year war, and the other one in the 30 years, whereby Spain reached an agreement with other countries, including France, because of the fear of great enemies, Catalonia and Portugal. The Westphalia agreements gave birth to this international public law, and the legislation for the nations sought for us to understand through peaceful ways. President Chavez, in many of his speeches, called to reformulate and refound the United Nations because he understood that public international law that ruled these nations was useless. 193 nations that are there do not play an important role. Tomorrow they will take a decision that will surely vote against the blockade against the sister nation of Cuba, and nevertheless it is enough for the United States to place the veto against 190 countries. Therefore, the United Nations must be reformulated. I would like to ask you in these last seconds we have, what consequences could the U.S. withdrawal have? There are many. First, we must recognize they still are a very important military force. This would allow the United States to continue developing an arms race without any kind of control. It would also allow that would happen with Russia. I've been watching Russian international policy. I think Foreign Minister Lavrov, that has 12, 13 years in that position, has kept respect in his actions, respect for nations, cooperation and solidarity, which we cannot say the same in Mike Pompeo. So there's a different political situation between both governments. I think that the United States are reviving the expansionist policy that Roosevelt implemented in the 20th century in what they called the borderless country. The United States consider themselves the owners of the planet. They call themselves the owners of the world, and they want to be the commanders of the world. I think that, but I repeat, the conditions are not the same today. They are different, and the peoples today are not willing to leave any empire killing them, and that we see Syria resisting. Some other African peoples in Latin America also are resisting. Therefore, subjection that could exist in some years is no longer there. Could we see U.S. failure in some years and the need to continue expansionist plans? To keep the war, you need energy, and you know that U.S. stock reserves stocks are being depleted, and they need to replace those stocks. So therefore, I think that in the midterm, the United States would fail in their attempts. Thank you very much for coming. We'll go to our conclusions. The United States, with a military expense of more than $600 billion a year and the provision of weapons to the war, insists in its defensive capacities to affirm its hegemony. But in times of multilateralism, a pluricentral world, that aspiration finds a wall. The protagonism of the military and strategic superiority of the United States has been displaced by other developments. They are concealed actions that show us that the arms race has never ended, and that it must be contained now more than ever, and that these agreements make us doubt of the credibility of international legal framework. Thank you very much. We end Critical Mood.